So I'm MJ from the Wayland Library, and Jane and I have been becoming friends over the last 5 years. And one of my first encounters with Jane was, that all of the local history materials used to be locked up in the cage. And she was actually physically present when I pulled out an original edition of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, edited by Lydia Mariah Child. And so we were just like, oh my goodness, yeah, because I hadn't seen it before. And so since that time, we've just been bonding over anything historical. And I'm planning to do similar research, not with a book, on Waltham history, coming soon, Waltham slavery in Waltham, and I'm going to be turning to her for that as well. So welcome, Jane. Oh, she's been like, she worked for 30 years for the National Park Service, and she's just like an amazing speaker, but you probably all know that already, so.
Well, MJ has really, I have my work cut out for me with that introduction, that I'm a tremendous speaker. This is my first in-person program. So it's been Zoom, and yes, the weather is nice. I was starting to think that if you wanted inclement weather, you should schedule me, but tonight it actually worked. I want to thank MJ for that lovely introduction, and Scarlett, and Courtney, who makes me look good. It's not like a technological fool, and the Historical Society, the Wayland Free Public Library, both very long and old friends. So this is the cover of the book right here. And with it, I paired a quote by one of my favorite people, Lydia Mariah Child, whom I have admired and studied for many years. She is arguably the most famous person who ever lived in Wayland, nationally known in the 19th century while largely unknown. We hope to change that sometime in her hometown. She has been elected to the National Women's Hall of Fame and one of the few white faces seen at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. She's an author, abolitionist, champion of human rights. Child lived in Wayland for the last 27 years of her life. She is buried along with her husband, David, at North Cemetery in Wayland. And so the quote states that while we bestow our earnest disapprobation on the system of slavery, let us not flatter ourselves that we are in reality any better than our brethren in the South. Thanks to our soil and climate and the early exertions of the Quakers, the form of slavery does not exist among us, but the very spirit of the hateful and mischievous thing is here in all its strength. Quite a lot to take in. So this quote comes from Child's groundbreaking book called An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans, in which she addressed both slavery and prejudice toward persons of color. And although by 1833, Massachusetts claimed no enslaved persons or enslavers, Child did not have to look far into the past to discover them right where she lived. And even though I've dedicated this book to my husband, Tom, I also secretly or privately, I guess, in my mind, also dedicate this to Lydia Mariah Child, because she really deserves a lot of credit. So the next one is a set of, Miss Courtney, yes, is a set of 1600s slave chains. This happens to come from a Southern, but the iron chains in the 1600s, whether you were in the North or South, they look quite similar. And for that, I'm going to read a passage from the book and it is about a man named Benjamin Crane. It is perhaps fitting that the first documentation of an enslaved person in colonial Sudbury is a record of unspeakable horror. It serves as a poignant reminder that all enslaved persons were subject to the will and whim of a master, regardless of the circumstances. Some were luckier than others, at least in regard to physical torment. In Sex and Middlesex, which sounds like a fun book, but there's some really serious scholarship in that book. Author Roger Thompson combed the Middlesex County court records from the 1600s and 1700s to discover this despicable act of Benjamin Crane of Sudbury toward his Negro boy in 1665. And the trial, and this is a quote from Thompson. Witnesses described the boy wearing a gear of wire, presumably a kind of muzzle, and a chain hobbling his feet. He had heard screaming. He had been heard screaming, "Oh Lord," from a distance of a quarter of a mile off. And he had many strike wounds, some raw, some healed or partly healed. And then back to the book that I wrote. Contrary to what the modern reader might expect, the complaint was not brought by the Negro boy or those who witnessed his tattered back, but by Benjamin Crane, who had suffered from multiple attempts by his young slave to run away. At the trial, the constable, who had witnessed the scars left by Crane's cruelty, testified that he had reproved the boy for his untoward carriage toward his master and returned the boy to Crane, as the law required. As the constable retreated, he heard the boy's screams from his next beating. Other witnesses also testified to the repeated beatings that the enslaved boy suffered from Crane, but these comments were offered to demonstrate the boy's bad character and not the despicable act of a brutal master. This is just one of the stories that surfaced when researching colonial Sudbury. And the next one I really could skip over here, and it is a map. The other day I did one for the Congregational Library and Archives on Zoom. And the first letter I got about my program came from Munich, Germany. So you can understand why I do put in a map of Massachusetts. The solid red triangle is the Sudbury and Wayland, about 20 miles west of Boston, as you know, but we'll go right into the specific map that were used in the book, created for the book. So today, Wayland and Sudbury are fiercely independent communities, at least when it comes to its early history. We still argue over that, whose residents are largely unaware of its long ago connection. The period of enslavement, when it was legal and accepted in Sudbury, are the years in which they were one town. And therefore, the book Enslavement in the Puritan Village refers to both Wayland and Sudbury and gives me what I've come to realize is a unique perspective, as that colonial world is the one that I live in much of the time. And you'll see it again when it comes to the revolution, still one town. These maps were done specifically for this book by GIS coordinator Brendan Decker, showing Wayland and Sudbury as one town, which it was from 1639 to 1780. Called Sudbury Plantation when it was first settled on the east side of the Sudbury River. That's the Wayland side. In 1638, it was incorporated a year later. The settlement soon expanded onto the west side of the river. And one town it remained from 1639 to 1780, when it divided largely along the river which had long posed an impediment to traveling from one side to the other, especially at various times of the year. And it was the subject of much contention. So finally, when they got the second parish in the 1720s, there were now two parishes, one on each side of the river, which reduced some of the conflicts. However, town meetings alternated both sides of the river, and the town selectmen, the government was one town. So the selectmen were selectmen for the combined Sudbury and Wayland, and all officials represented both sides. So when I talk about Sudbury, that was the name of the town until 1780. Wayland then became East Sudbury, and finally Wayland in 1835. But when I say the word Sudbury, I am talking about the combined Wayland and Sudbury. But why did I refer to it as the Puritan Village? And Courtney will change the slide.
Oh.
Yeah, I was nodding to you. Yes. Huh? So in 1964, Sumner Chilton Powell was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in History for his book, Puritan Village. In it, he detailed the formation of one town as a model for the formation of many New England towns. As he explained in his introductions, and I quote Mr. Powell, Professor Powell, one town well documented in relation to its specific origins can serve as a representative study for most New England towns until further investigation takes place. And the term well documented, this is in the early 60s, in the age of intense analysis, is a romantic one. It would be fair to admit that one can at best find fragments of legal records and then make reasonable assumptions about the growth of any community, leaving many vital questions involving motivations and feelings unanswered. Most early townsmen were far too busy to sit back each evening and write journals and diaries. And today this is still true. There's many places in the book where I have to leave many vital questions unanswered. Really sad to say. The town he chose to document as the Puritan Village was Colonial Sudbury. Because of the richness of their early records, it was indeed well documented. His book is different from mine. I didn't win the Pulitzer Prize. One thing, in that, but it details the formation of a New England town in its earlier years. So he looks basically at Sudbury, the founding of Sudbury from 1640 to 1660. And he also examines the places in England where the founders originated. Mine has a somewhat later focus, but it should be noted that even in the Revolutionary War period, the inhabitants of colonial Sudbury were the descendants of Anglo-Saxon immigrants. A number of them descended from the original inhabitants of Sudbury Plantation. There was no mention of enslaved persons of African descent in his book. However, detailed records and even occasional letters and journals continued. So history didn't stop, records didn't stop when Powell was through with his book, but continued to be produced and retained long after the period Powell wrote about. And these records confirm the presence of enslaved people in this town. Like most people who grew up, and I'll tell you about myself and how I came to write this book, like most people who grew up in and were educated in the North, I never learned about the existence of slavery in places where I lived. It was, after all, a Southern phenomenon, according to history books. And so I lived blissfully unaware of its existence in the North, in New England, and in the places where I lived or worked. Until that is, I started working in Concord in 1986. And then I learned the truth, or started to learn the truth, required reading for docents. I first worked at the Old Manse next to the North Bridge. I read Bob Gross's The Minutemen and Their World, and it was written for the bicentennial. He wrote about the existence of enslaved persons in Concord at the start of the American Revolution. Even men who stood up for their rights as Englishmen on April 19th, 1775 at the North Bridge in Concord and on Lexington Green were depriving others of their freedom. And so I learned about enslaved persons who lived in Concord at the start of the American Revolution. That was it. After becoming a historical interpretive park ranger at Minuteman National Historical Park in 1990, I learned even more. At some point, I saw a book for sale at the Northbridge Visitor Center, republished by Vanity Press, and for a paperback, quite expensive. And that's one of its permutations. I've worn out 3 copies of this book and now has a fancy cover that I put over on that other table. And it was Lorenzo Green's The Negro in Colonial New England, first published in 1942 by a Black professor of history at Lincoln University in Missouri. It is not an overstatement to say that that book changed my life. Always drawn to stories of people overlooked in traditional history books, it opened a new world for me. I had to know more. How could I not have known about something that happened where I lived and worked and that I considered vital to my understanding of the world that was and is? And I should add that in the late 1980s and early 1990s, few tours or programs in the North made any mention of enslavement, or in the few cases that did, it was primarily about runaway slaves who had escaped the South in the 19th century. So reeling from my new acquaintance with the existence of enslavement in the North, gleaned from Professor Green's book, I still had little understanding of its magnitude and meaning. Certainly it had not happened in Wayland, where I had already lived for 20 years, and now it's over 50 years, or I would have heard of it. And not just what we know today as Wayland, but as I noted earlier, modern Sudbury, since they were, as I said, one town from 1639 to 1780. This is the period covered in my book when enslavement was accepted and legal and part of everyday life in Massachusetts. I should have known before I did. The Hudson's History of Sudbury, first published in 1889, for example, devotes 1 page out of over 600 pages to something called servants, by which the author meant slaves, never used the word, but it did not register. I now know that servants was the preferred term by the Puritans for all those who served, including slaves. Even ministers were servants of God. On some tax records, slaves are designated as servants for life. It is an unsettling experience to think about slavery, as I'm sure you're all experienced in the town one lives in. And we are in the town I live in. It must be processed mentally and emotionally, if it is processed at all. I had studied enough history to want to process it, even though I firmly believed when I first started to think about it, that I would find nothing at all in local records. I started to read all the history books I could find that focused on enslavement in the North and New England in particular. No published histories included Sudbury in their list of communities that had been studied. even though I discovered that there was ample evidence in existing documents that slavery existed in Sudbury. Perhaps this is just my speculation. It was the nearness to Concord, founded along the same river 3 years earlier, that made it less appealing to scholars. And by the way, at least one enslaved man had ties to that community, as the stories of enslavement in Sudbury go beyond the borders of the one town. So when I retired in 2017, I looked at all the information I had gathered over at least 20 years and tried to figure out what to do with it. I now had many references to enslaved people in colonial Sudbury, gleaned from years of research. Even better, I had the time to add to my research. I could pursue stories that I had only noted before. The availability of digital materials was a revelation to me. My 25 years of research spanned a revolution in technology, from microfilm to digital scanned images, from in-person appointments. Tanya, you can relate to all of this. and research facilities, to instant gratification of requests for information sent right to my email inbox. I could read out of print books through Internet Archive and Google Books. During the pandemic, and I know it was an awful thing, but it was unbelievable for researchers, because online resources then became my main source of information. My request for information and questions led by copious scanned documents arriving at my computer. I even offered to go with masks. I offered to go with gloves, whatever. And they said, no, 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 we will send it to you. And that's how I got them. So of special mention are Caitlin Jones at Mass Archives, who was phenomenal, and Nate Smith, the archivist for the town of Concord, who sent me literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of scanned images. But first and foremost is the incredible resource that is the Sudbury Archives, that they provided, even a searchable database, even in 2000, of town records from 1639 to 1850, including Wayland records, of course, that only went up to 1780. Started in 1991 by the town of Sudbury as an early endeavor to make town records available to the public, the Sudbury Archives has been greatly expanded and continues to be so. Many of these records were available to Sumner Chilton Powell, of course, as he did his research, but the ease of access today is a treasure beyond compare for someone investigating the town's history. I could now go back and add to my research. I could pursue stories I had only noted before without leaving home. When I could once again make in-person visits, I had a chance to check some of my findings, especially if I only saw transcriptions. I went to look at the originals and compared them. And while they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, you can achieve the unimaginable if you care enough to persevere and have children and grandchildren to turn to for guidance. Writing the book was one journey, and the technological revolution was yet another one. I'm still coping with that, by the way. Thank you, Courtney, for helping me with my slides. Never before published, these stories from preserved records highlight the lives of men, women, and children held in bondage. The accounts of life in colonial Sudbury and their interactions with nearby towns, including bills of sale, marriages, medical, and military records, expand the knowledge of enslavement and its pervasive impact, yet unquestioned acceptance. in Sudbury and similar pre-revolutionary New England towns. And so with all of that, I decided that perhaps I should write a book. The book, I'll talk about the book, consists of several sections, with the most satisfying being stories that can be told with some insight into the lives of enslaved persons and their masters. And for that, I have mainly Reverend Israel Loring to thank. That is his home, which is today the home of the Sudbury History Center, or headquarters of the Sudbury Historical Society, built around 1700. Reverend Loring is really the star of my book. I concluded the other day, I probably wouldn't have had a book without all that he had to say. But anyway, he was minister in Sudbury, starting on the east side, and then when the two parishes came, he opted to go to the west side, but he was minister altogether for 66 years, from his arrival in town in 1706 until his death in 1772. His copious journals cover most of the 18th century, when owning slaves was legal and accepted in Massachusetts. More than any other records, his entries give a human face to the men and women he enslaved and those who were enslaved by others. His words bring to life those who occupied a netherworld between property and personhood, in which glimpses of personalities emerge. And so the next will show a little snippet of Israel Loring's journals. I started reading them or read them the first time about 25 years ago. And as you can see, it is not an easy task even then, but it is that much harder for me rereading them today. But they were records that breathe life into an enslaved person are so few and far between, but those that do are priceless. In his journals, we get some insight into the world of his enslaved boy, Simeon, and another person who figures largely in the book, Nero Benson, a member of Loring's West Side Church, and a formerly enslaved man, as they take on vivid but still elusive personalities, leaving you craving for more knowledge and understanding of their lives. So here is an entry on Simeon, and it's just a small sampling of the journals that I read. So there are two things, even in this little short paragraph, that we learn about Simeon in this, where he was born and brought up, which was the Loring parsonage, and that he had a mother who had never been mentioned before, who was present in his life, coupled with other entries about Simeon until his death at the age of 21, shortly after he was emancipated. This gives a glimpse into Simeon's life and that of his enslaver and family. And so very sadly, it's one-sided. All the information we have is one-sided. There is no documentation that has been yet discovered of words by someone who had been enslaved in Sudbury. If I had to wish for new information surfacing, that would be it. Currently, so we do not know the thoughts, the perspective of the enslaved persons on the events detailed in Loring's journals or any other sources. But most of the existing records are not as copious and as filled with information as Reverend Loring's. They are impersonal, providing little or no insight into the lives of the enslaved, highlighting that person's value as property. Despite this, they can still offer up a few clues that can add to a greater understanding of enslavement. And so the next slide is the 1754 slave census. And this is probably the least personal of all, and that was Governor William Shirley, the British governor of Massachusetts, Massachusetts province, asked for a count of enslaved people, and 9 males and 5 females are enumerated, giving no names of either the enslaved or the enslavers. That's about as impersonal as you get. What you do learn is that this no doubt reduces the total number of, by excluding children in bondage, because the minimum age to report was 16. Enslaved children were often excluded in census and valuation records, as they were not considered. And this is again my deduction. They were not considered to be as productive workers as adults. So sometimes the upper limit was stipulated in 1771 valuation, which gave value to servants for life. The enslavers were taxed for them, and they were only those between the ages of 14 and 45. So enslaved persons below or above those ages were not, again, my take, considered to be in their prime work years, and their enslavers were not taxed for them. The names of the enslavers appeared, but not those of the enslaved. So I think there's there again the emphasis on what is their worth as property. So now comes the emancipation of Nero Benson. And this is a transcription of it, but I have seen the original. And this offers a rare glimpse of another kind of record. It is the only documented reference to an enslaved man who lived in Sudbury being given his freedom. What is most remarkable about it, to me, is that while it is largely impersonal, you know there is a great story contained in this act. What motivated Samuel Wood, the master, to free Nero Benson, and at considerable cost to himself. By law, you had to put up 50 pounds to emancipate someone. Samuel Wood put up 100 pounds toward the, and this is a quote, to save the said town harmless from all and any charge towards the support and maintenance of Nero Benson. Nero Benson's freedom had to come with a guarantee that the town would never bear any expense for his care. I talk about this in much greater detail in the book, but equally intriguing to me, which I don't know, are the qualities that Nero Benson possessed that led to his freedom, especially since Samuel Wood had at least one other slave whom he didn't free. So the last text, we come to the probate inventory, which is at the Wayland Historical Society of Jonas Noyes, who died in 1775 as a young man in a smallpox epidemic that was also happening at the same time the revolution started on April 19th. So as I said before, most enslaved people were referred to as servants, which was favored by the Puritans over the word slaves. But this poses difficulties to a modern researcher in determining status. When a value is assigned, as in this inventory, he was worth 53 pounds, 6 shillings, 8 pence. That person is owned. He is property. There is no doubt about it. Enslaved persons, but never used the word slave. Enslaved persons were often listed in inventories along, and there was a pecking order, furniture, whatever. So the enslaved persons were listed usually with livestock and crops, and also gives you an indication that they worked outside, that they were doing farming. So no matter what you call it, that person is a slave. And he was still worth the 53 pounds and change, the same as when Jonas Noyes bought him from his father, Colonel John Noyes, in 1767. And our next slave owner is the Reverend Samuel Parris. So he was another slave owner who left an enslaved person named Violet or Violet, or he called her in his will. And that is the oldest house. Thank you, Gretchen, for I think you is the oldest house still standing in Wayland today. And so he was left in Violet, and he was known slaveholder. You probably, if you recognize his name at all, it is because of his involvement in witchcraft, a scare in Salem Village in 1692, where the witchcraft troubles started. Guess where? Right in his own house, which is probably why you might recognize his name. There is no mention of his enslaved woman Tituba, who also became quite famous during that time in Sudbury, but there has been speculation as to Tituba's relationship to Violet. Violet was left to Parris's son Samuel, along with some books, a silver seal, an agate case of knives, a horse, and a colt. Middlesex County probate records are well preserved. They are accessible online and a great resource for identifying enslaved persons. And then last will be another member of the Benson family, and that is the sale of Frank or Francis Benson. This document was lost for a number of years. And actually, when I finished the book, it was found in a closet in the back in the dark at the Goodnow Library. And so I asked if I could include it in the book because I thought the story was fascinating. But bills of sale are property deeds that transfer ownership from one enslaver to another for a monetary amount. The story of Frank Benson is one that crosses other nearby towns. Born in Framingham, bequeathed to John Swift, who was the minister of Acton. In his father's will, he originally belonged to Reverend John Swift, the same name, who was the first minister of Framingham, and Frank or Francis Benson was soon sold for 200 pounds to Josiah Richardson, a prominent member, a citizen of Sudbury. So this deed, owned by the Goodnow Library in Sudbury, yielded another surprise. On the reverse side, and they're both in the book, was a commentary by a man named Thomas Stearns, who collected Sudbury town documents. He added a handwritten note on the reverse side. Both sides of the document, as I said, are featured in the book, containing the following sentence, and I did compare the handwriting, so I can tell you that it was indeed written by Thomas Stearns. And he wrote on the back, how any man, because this was Reverend John Swift, how any man professing to be a minister of Christ could be guilty of the atrocious crime of trafficking in human flesh is inconceivable to us at the present day. Stearns died in 1844, when slavery was flourishing in America and ministers owned slaves, but not in Sudbury. Sounds good enough, I guess. And so the last part of the book is unusual, I would say. It's a very long index. It doesn't look like that in the book, but it's an appendix and not an index, it's an appendix. And the appendix contains a timeline of enslavement in Sudbury, listing all the references that contain that contain documentation of enslavement and even extends beyond the years that slavery was legal in Massachusetts, but still had an impact in Sudbury, for which there was not enough information to fit into the text, but considerably heightens the impact of enslavement in Sudbury. Included in the book with sources and notes. Hopefully it will be supplemented when new documentation of enslavement in Sudbury surfaces. Did I see Doug come in? Yes, he's responsible for what the appendix looks like with his encouragement. It is a vital part of the book, so thank you. And I will now rest my case, and if there's questions, comments, thank you. Yes.
I'm curious, when slavery may have been at its peak, if you will, in terms of the city of slaves, how many would that have been in Sudbury?
Well, it's hard to tell. Because as I say, the census, if they had an age requirement, you're undercounting. In 1771, for example, I think there were 12 mentioned between 14 and 45, but even within that, the slave owners were trying to minimize their number because they were paying taxes. So I would say in Sudbury at one time, I would say there might have been a high of about 30.
About how much?
30. But that's a guess. And anybody? Yes.
Two questions. Did you just say that they had to pay taxes on their slaves?
Yes, they had to pay taxes for owning. Yes, there is also was a thing that you were supposed to pay a tax if you had a slave and bought a slave. Its enforcement was
Like a property tax?
well, you had to pay a tax on owning. Yes, it's a property. Yes, that's your property. Yeah.
Second question, this is more of a meta question, I guess. I was reading the Iliad last summer.
Okay.
The captives from Troy became slaves.
Mhm,
Well, there've been slaves throughout the history of the
Mhm.
world,
mhm.
usually as a real result of conquest. Did you pick up any sense in your research of why this incredible movement against slavery began in the English-speaking world in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries? Really a phenomenal change in world history. Did you get any sense of what caused that, other than the Quakers and Christian history?
Well, are you talking about this country? Because it started first in England.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I'm talking about the English-speaking.
And I
world.
think they were not, didn't see enough need for them. But yes, it's hard to, it's a whole area to explore. And I don't have a lot of information because especially in Sudbury, nobody articulated an anti-slavery stance. And yet it was the slave owners were by and large wealthy men who had quite a bit, and yet there were men who had quite a bit who did not have slaves. And why did they not have
It's
slaves?
a phenomenal change in world
It was a
history.
phenomenal change in history. And yes, I will put it on my to
Next
pursue. No, I think I'm done. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
so there was a huge labor shortage in the colonies during that time.
Mhm.
Perhaps the people who didn't own slaves had lots of sons,
Yeah.
and so they didn't need extra help.
Well, that's the possibility, but it's hard to determine without more evidence and more documentation. If they had objections. I do quote a passage in my book, a quote by John Adams, who said he never had a slave, never would have a slave. So that's the 1700s, and he is articulating that.
Right, he wasn't a farmer.
Yes, he was a farmer. Yes, he was a farmer.
Abby
Yes,
was
the
the farmer.
Yeah, Abigail took care of the farm when he was off lawyering and politicking.
Abigail also enslaved an individual.
Huh?
Abigail also enslaved.
Yes, well, she inherited because she was from a wealthy family, but John Adams himself expressed it. Nobody that I have come across in Sudbury has expressed that. So I, I hope there was some, but I don't know.
Where did they get these slaves? How did they come into?
Well, they
Sudbury?
all were part of the slave trade. And
And how did that connect to?
well, it
such a remote
connected.
Location.
It connected a lot with the West Indies. It was really the economy. I talk a little bit in my book about that. The need, and it usually wasn't the best slaves, the most vigorous slaves, but it was one that people put in orders for them. And
And
if a boat came in,
Did Rhode Island appear in there? I mean, it was.
Rhode Island had
Was
more.
a center of slave
Yeah,
trade.
Rhode Island had more enslaved people. But the other thing I distinguish between in the book is the fact that enslavement was different in towns, inland towns, and different in Boston. In port towns, Rhode Island had significant port towns, as did Boston, Salem. So yes, there was more, but they have a different story. These were people that were used as farm laborers in the country, and I do talk about that. Unfortunately, basically, a lot more attention was paid to what happened in Boston than what happened to Sudbury.
Well, when there were 20 or 30 slaves in Sudbury, what was the total population of the town?
So Sudbury at the start of the revolution had over 2,000 people in the combined Sudbury. So it was a big town.
Yeah.
It was a good sized town. And they also, well, I foreshadow my next program, but they also sent more men to on April 19th and the revolution then.
So what's
than
the
any
title
other
of your
time.
next
No,
presentation?
no, it's right over there. There's the dawn of the American,
Oh,
Wayland and Sudbury and the dawn of the American Revolution.
oh, very good.
You mentioned that there's some sort of a connection possibly between this Violet, nefarious inheritance, and Tituba from Salem Village. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you think that?
Okay, so she is identified with a male John at some point, so there might have been opportunity. What really is the interesting story of Violet is that depending on how familiar you are with the witchcraft trials, that Tituba so Violet winds up not in Sudbury or Wayland. She winds up living in Concord with Benjamin Barrett. And Benjamin Barrett's wife was Betty Paris, who was the little girl with Abigail Williams that had started in Reverend Paris's house with his daughter.
Tituba's story.
Yes, and she had a slave named Violet. So is that the same Violet as was here in 1720? Well, one of the problems, nobody has conclusively documented that it was yet, that I've seen, and I pursued this a lot of ways. And the other is the fact that very often, if you were an enslaved person, they might call you a woman, or they could call you a maidservant, or they could call you a girl. So it's hard to identify because he called her a girl when he died in 1720, Samuel Paris. Was she a girl? Or when she, much later, was she now an old woman? So it's the way, what is a girl back then? It's really up to you. So I speculate, I think there's certainly connection on all of these, but I can't document it, so I don't say it in the book. That's simple as that. Yes, ma'am.
A question online, do we know where any of the slaves from Colonial Sudbury are buried?
Yes,
And if so, where?
not too many.
Not many.
So Simeon is at Revolutionary Cemetery in Sudbury. And he does have a marker. And then I worked very hard to identify and conclusively call, which had been referred to as slaves at North Cemetery, Flora and Pied de Bouze. For many years, they had been identified as slaves. What bothered me, because when they died in the 1800s, they most certainly were not enslaved. So, but I have come to the conclusion, and I think I can prove, so mostly I try to have hard and fast documentation, but if it adds up, and I'll say it, and say that this adds up to me, that Peter and Flora, who are now buried behind John Noyce's ostentatious stone, that they were at some point enslaved to the Noyce family. Yeah, Sam.
Was there any evidence that you found of liaisons between masters and enslaved women?
No, not in Sudbury. I didn't, however. So there is the question of Simeon, who was born in Reverend Loring's household in Sudbury. And no father mentioned and no mother mentioned until he died, and then you find out that that when she's now freed, but Hannah had been enslaved to Reverend Loring, and there's no talk ever of a father. So a lot of people, I think Sudbury is more into that, kind of connecting that. There may have been, I don't think so. I think that if there was any, let's say, hinky-panky with Simeon and the Lorings, it was probably one of his children. But I don't say it because I can't document it. It's just purely speculation.
I think I read that they allowed marriage here,
Yes.
encouraged
Oh,
marriage,
yeah.
but the man and the woman had to live in separate places.
Well, they lived with their owners.
Yeah.
Unless they had the same owner.
Yeah.
And they lived with their owners, and so only so long as the owner didn't sell one of them. You know,
Going back to the North Cemetery, isn't there something intriguing about the orientation of graves?
okay, so I worked
You know
very hard
anything
on
about
that for
this?
many years, and I talked to people that studied gravestones. And if you look at Simeon's grave in Sudbury, it is not at a different angle from the others. If you look at them in Lincoln, there's one in Lincoln, they're not in different orientation. So I conclude that, you know, maybe they fit behind the plot. I don't know the answer to that, but yes, I've heard it for many years that we were facing in a different way and that it had a significance. And worked very hard to try to find an answer to that. And what I've seen as evidence in other enslaved people's burials is that it wasn't anything hard and fast. So it was the choice, or perhaps it's how it fit in to the Noyce family plot. I don't know. Unless somebody else does. Gina.
What did you find about causes of death? Say some of these individuals were really young in their 20s, and was it part of the marginalization that there was not even a record of why they died? That's kind of silent. What did you find?
Well, there wasn't necessarily a record of how a lot of people died. So, I mean, usually the burial was noted. Lots of records for church records in Sudbury, and they'll talk about the death, the age of the person died, but they don't go a lot for causes. Now, one of the great sources for information was there was one medical doctor in Colonial Sudbury, depending on which Roby it was, Dr. Roby, senior and junior. And he was the one medical doctor, and he kept account books that are now at Harvard Countway Library. And he would tell you, if he made a visit to someone, he would tell you what the ailment was as far as he knew it, or what the prescription was, what he did for them. So that's the better source of information than death records, at least that I've come across. Now,
Did you find anything regarding Native Americans?
okay, so Native Americans, I could not find, and I've, you know, talked to people who know far more than I do about Native Americans. And there is no documentation of a Native American being enslaved in Colonial Sudbury. It may have happened, and without documentation, I suspect if it happened early on. The other connection to Native Americans is that there was a lot more connection than I realized and that I can document until I get to the Revolutionary War era between the praying Indian community of Natick and the enslaved in Sudbury, because if an enslaved man married a Native American woman, that child was not enslaved.
Just one other question regarding the Native American piece. I just coincidentally read today of the demolition of the oldest house in Natick, for which there is a history, quite involved history of Native Americans. I think that house was built in 1629 and was in the family for a long period of time. It's interesting. So I don't know if you've come across that.
I know, but I'll look for it.
You said that Paris was associated with the Salem witch trials.
Yeah, it
Did it
started
come from.
Yeah, he married, well, he married, for a second wife, he married one of the, Peter Noyes, one of the founders of Sudbury Plantation, one of the daughters, Dorothy Noyes, and it's the Noyes Paris House, which is the oldest house. It's Greenways today, that belonged really to her family. And I guess he got in there because it later belonged to the Paris family. You can correct this, Gretchen. Huh?
It was Dorothy Noyes.
Yeah, Dorothy. Well, he married Dorothy Noyes, and her father was a founder of Sudbury, Peter Noyes. Darling.
Well, for folks interested in data, you know, page 74 talks about eve of revolution and census data in Lorenzo's book.
That's my Bible, yes.
Yes, definitely. But I guess my question for you would be, you know, now that this information is more public, now that we're talking about it as a community, how do you think Wayland can better respond to the fact that these people were a community? I think it's a bigger community discussion, but folks have historian hat on, and with your, you know, long time living here, what are your thoughts on how we can?
I guess I'd like to see, of course, I have a particular passion to see Lydia Mariah Child recognized for her efforts. And I'd like to see those who were enslaved recognized for what they did, or some kind of memorial or monument, plaque or whatever that might be visible in the town. That would commemorate them. Lydia Mariah Child didn't get a school. She didn't get even a street named for her, which I find very hard to believe and to reconcile. But yes, I think there should be some recognition. I'll tell you that on the 29th of March, I'm going to be part of a roundtable in Concord at the library, because a man from Lincoln just came out with the history of enslavement in Lincoln. And a woman in Concord has been studying enslavement in Concord. And we're going to get together, the three of us with Bob Gross from the Minutemen and their world, and kind of talk about it, not just as a single town phenomenon, which is pretty much the way it's been studied, town per town, but there's a bigger picture here. And the head of special collections at the Concord Free Public Library decided that she would like to initiate some kind of reach out to say that these communities were not in isolation, but there is a bigger picture that I've always thought that putting them together, you're going to get a very realistic picture. Everything I've read, there's a lot of similarities and overlaps. Certainly the laws apply to everyone, the whole concept of being property and not a person, but the whole concept that, yeah, that this is a movement that we need to understand. I'd love to see, if I was younger, but I'm not, I'm too old now. But if I were much younger, I'd love to see a central repository where people could put their information for each town and look at each town. So each town has unique history, of course, but it also has a common history from settlement. And certainly when it comes to enslaved people, there is a common history that would together put a picture of exactly what is the nature of enslavement. So people who always say, well, it was better up here, I beg to differ in some cases, but at least you would actually see beyond just a local level. I could tell you the horror story about Benjamin Crane and another horror story about a young boy, but there were lots of horror stories. And there were, and as far as I'm concerned, it all really was based on what kind of master you had. They had total control. So if you had someone who wasn't going to beat you to a pulp, okay, then maybe we'll say you're lucky in as far as physical torment. But basically the master had the say, and what he decided to do with you, sell you away from your family. Yes, as you said, Sandy, husbands and wives did not live together. If you had a child, the child lived with the mother, and all of it was up for sale. So if somebody was sold, they weren't sold. They were never allowed to have a home of their own or one place they could live. And if that's not horrific, I don't know what is. To never be allowed to have a life as a person. So that really, but there's an overall picture that I think would tell more of the story and still keep the individuality of every community.
Jane, do you think that the museum in Washington is a place that is maybe already collecting?
So the people that are doing the most right now are the American Ancestors, the New England Historical Genealogical Society. They just took over the Harvard thing that was canceled by Harvard, and they seem to be doing more to bring these stories to life, what they call 10 million names. Which is really a beautiful thing and worth pursuing. And they're also trying to identify families, and names of people that survived. So yeah, that is the organization right now that's really in the vanguard of doing this.
Maybe we could hook into that.
Well, I'm hoping to,
Have you been able to discover anything, stories about what happened to people as slaves were freed?
Yes, I do. Okay, so I do talk about that and in the book. And basically, they were enslaved. They didn't have any money. unless you were taught a skill, you didn't have those. So you figure it out. And so what took your place was prejudice, which I believe
But were they
still.
allowed to live in certain areas? Were they
Where
granted
could they afford to
land?
live?
You know, I mean,
No,
just think
no,
about like.
not granted, not
Concord.
granted land.
Yeah,
If you could get some, but no, unless you're in, a few instances in Weston where the master actually gave land or sold land to the enslaved person. I did not find that in here. But it did happen in Weston, for example, because I did their their thing too. But
Well, for some individuals, they'd end up going to Boston or.
yeah, most
Worcester
of,
to
well, I
figure-
talked about,
Yeah,
they fled the country because there was nothing. But so in 1790, when Massachusetts claimed they had absolutely no enslaved people, there were 11 people of color that were living in Sudbury. 2 were on the west side, and they belong, I can identify them. They belonged to Ezekiel Howe, the proprietor of the Wayside Inn, and 9 lived in what we call East Sudbury, Wayland, and they primarily lived with their enslavers, because where were they gonna go? They had no money.
So the presumption is that they had money, that the enslavers had money.
Yeah,
I
but
mean,
it
200
costs money.
200 pounds.
Yeah, it costs money.
Sounds like a lot of money.
Well, I mean, the last sale was Ezekiel Howe in 1779 for 200 pounds. You're talking inflationary,
Right.
Revolutionary War prices, and he's paying. So, Dennis.
Did you find any commonality or distinction between the jobs the enslaved people may have had? Were they house servants, field workers? Were there any trades involved?
So I couldn't find trades here. Yes, some were trained, but not they were farm laborers, and they worked with the masters who also were farm. A lot of the masters worked the farm. They were farmers. They worked, if they're with the livestock and crops, they're working on a farm, and that's what they did. And the women were mostly house servants, doing indoor work, sewing.
Well, that leads to the question. Could you differentiate how many men are we talking? How many, which we'll assume are field workers? How many women are we talking about? Did you find any?
Yeah, there were
numbers of
more.
that?
There were more men than women. I'll tell you that. There were more men because the land needed more help apparently than some of these ladies who had, 6 kids and maybe the oldest one was old enough to help out. Yes.
I would guess not, as today, testing at any role.
I think some of that this is all going on now, but then I think that's some of the intent of what American Ancestors is.
Jane,
Trying
what
to-
was the question, please?
Huh?
What was his question?
Genetic testing.
Oh,
I think that. Oh, okay, she's telling me to put my microphone, sorry. Thank you, Sue. One more question. She's the boss, Kate.
I think, well, the first thing, what a researcher, and everything she tells us. That we have to appreciate those efforts, especially for the greater Sudbury area. But to go back to his question, I think, didn't you find that most of the tavern owners owned the largest number of slaves? And
Yeah, tavern owners, ministers, and doctors, I would say, are the biggies.
And then when you went on to look beyond that, when they were free, you found that they were paying poll taxes.
Yes. But they were still living in where, I mean, they weren't paying property tax or
Right.
anything else, so they
But
were
they-
living, they were living in the house that they were enslaved in.
so did they basically do their old jobs but got paid for it now?
Well, I don't know what the payment was. The one I could tell you most about was Portsmouth, who was Ezekiel Howe's, And Portsmouth, when he died, Ezekiel Howe, when he died, he doesn't put him in the inventory in the 1790s, but he does say that Portsmouth it should take care of his wife and her needs. So you can figure out, what the arrangements, Reverend Loring had freed Hannah, and she's still living in the house. She's now called, instead of called maidservant, I talk about that in the book, she's called hired maidservant, but what her, whether room and board was her pay, I don't know. So, yes, ma'am. That's it. She said that's.